Hello there.
Happy Valentine's Day, everyone, at least if you're watching this on the day it's released. I suppose I owe you the story behind why this video is happening. I mean, other than the patrons and members voting for it, which I am very grateful for, thank you. I was at a party in October at a friend's house, and the conversation moved on to Star Wars at some point, and I said these exact words that now haunt and curse me. Anakin Skywalker is an unfuckable oaf in Episode 2. And this caused a range of reactions. Two notable ones were people saying how much better I made all the guys in the room feel, which, to be clear, I never said any of them were particularly attractive, but then again, I do kind of have a type. The other reactions were more focused on defending the idea that they found Anakin attractive in that film, which I have to be honest left me confused because did we watch the same film? Anyway, I kind of went on an extended rant about this, which has now been adapted into a YouTube video, so you're welcome. This romance plotline is so bad that it lives rent-free in my head, and so this is going to be cathartic for me. What wasn't cathartic was watching all three of the prequel films just to verify that my memory wasn't failing me and that my friends were in fact right about this. Spoiler alert, they were not. Also, shout out to my friend Bridget Empire who came over to watch these with me. It made it tolerable and gave me an insight I will borrow later. This romance plotline would be so bad as to be distracting if it was a subplot. If there was an otherwise fine, more significant narrative going on over it, but we just got hit with the awkward, tense, poorly written romance, this would still stand out as bad, but at least it wouldn't be a structural problem, or at least it would be something we could quarantine from the rest of the plot because it wouldn't threaten the integrity of the story. Unfortunately, this romance plotline is at least 50% of the plot of Attack of the Clones, and is really integral to the overarching personal narrative of the protagonist, namely Anakin Skywalker, soon to be Darth Vader, which means that it being the way it is, and the impact it has on the integrity of the characters is not just bad on its own terms, but is one of the reasons why the prequel trilogy as a whole can be regarded as bad films. And I want to make that absolutely clear. These three films are bad, but I do still like them. And I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive, and I don't think they're wholly without merit. Even this romance plotline, which is an excellent microcosm of why the prequels ended up having to be rehabilitated via meme culture, which, on that note, I think this is a good time to actually get into the meat of the video, so I'll let Anakin himself take us in.
This is where the fun begins.
It's important before we get into the specifics that we understand the structure of the plot of Episode 2, because understanding it really emphasizes how important this romance plotline is supposed to be. Also, Episode 2 is, by some margin, the prequel film with the most potentially confusing plot structure, given all of the moving parts, so it's good to make sure that we're all on the same page here. The plot starts with Padme's ship being blown up in an assassination attempt, an attempt she blames on Count Dooku, a suggestion that's dismissed out of hand, but her very uttering is kind of a problem, but that's a problem with the non-romance parts of the plot, so we'll just put a pin in that, and maybe we'll talk about it another time, maybe we won't. Anakin and Obi-Wan are assigned to protect her and use her as bait for the assassins in order to lure them out, which, bizarrely and against all logic, works due to a series of contrivances and blind luck, which leads to our two Jedi characters being split up. Obi-Wan is sent to investigate the assassins, which leads to him unveiling the clone army supposedly ordered by a long-dead Jedi Master, and he doesn't quite get all the way to the complete story on his own, but is explicitly told everything he needs to know by Count Dooku, which, yeah, I guess we can accept that the Jedi don't have to take Dooku at his word. This plot intertwines with the key political plotline of this film, which is the Republic forming an army and granting Palpatine emergency powers in order to facilitate that. An army that Padme opposes as the platonic ideal of a liberal democratic anti-war politician. And I want, just to clarify, I mean liberal democratic in the sense of being a politician in a liberal democracy, not in the American sense of being a liberal Democrat, because the audience has got quite American heavy recently. Padme's absence is why this is all allowed to pass in the way that it is, with the comic relief character handing emergency powers to Palpatine. So why is Padme absent? Because Anakin, the real protagonist of this film, has been assigned to protect her. We'll spend a bit more time on this half of the plot because it's, more important for our purposes, because it's explicitly the one I want to talk about. But essentially, the protection gig functions as a way to make sure that Anakin and Padme are together for long enough that the mutual attraction that's supposed to exist between them, an attraction that's forbidden by their respective stations in life. Padme is one of the most prominent members of the anti-war faction in the Senate, and Anakin as a Jedi Padawan living under the shadow of a prophecy that puts impossible expectations on him. The key part here is that Anakin and Padme seesaw between indulging in this, in my view, entirely unbelievable, but again, we'll get to that because that's the point of the video, mutual attraction, and deciding that this isn't acceptable. Then, it appears our chosen one is being cursed by premonitions and his mother is in pain, which leads to Padme and Anakin going to Tatooine, where he finds out his mother has been kidnapped by the Sand People, and she died in his arms, leading to probably the single biggest flaw in the romance plotline. But again, put a pin in it. I know I'm saying that a lot, but let's just get through this plot as quickly as possible so that we're all on the same page. Obi-Wan, prior to getting captured, sent a message to Anakin, which he forwards to Coruscant, and because he's closer and with quite a bit of persuading from Padme, they go off to save Obi-Wan, allowing the stories to converge with this climactic scene prior to the gladiatorial execution that's been set up for them. Whereupon, accepting that they'll likely die, they both decide to commit to the feelings they've developed for each other. Then we get the big gladiatorial combat, the Jedi intervention, clones, Jango Fett is decapitated, and the heroes go off to confront Count Dooku and roundly get humiliated because they're both underpowered for this encounter and uncoordinated, meaning they have to get bailed out by Yoda. Then the Clone Wars begin. The end. Now, I appreciate that I've glossed over a lot of the fine details for the sake of both your time and my sanity, but I've also done it because I really want us to think about the structure and think about the components of this plot in abstract. The pieces are actually kind of there. And in principle, Attack of the Clones could have conveyed a lot of interesting themes, ideas, and development for its principal characters, but it just didn't. And one of the big reasons is that half of this plot is essentially the most important plot line of not just this film or the prequel trilogy, but I would argue of the first 6 films. It's worth explaining exactly why I believe that to be the case, just because it might need to be explicitly stated. The main character arc of the prequels is the fall of Anakin Skywalker to the dark side and his transformation into Darth Vader, which is supposed to parallel the transformation of the Republic into the Empire. One of the main catalysts for this is Anakin's attachments, something explicitly forbidden by the Jedi. If we look at Anakin in the prequels, we can see that he has what I'd call a full house of attachments. He has a fraternal bond with Obi-Wan, he has a paternal one with Palpatine, a maternal one with his mother, and to complete the set, you really need a romantic attachment provided by Padme. The only thing he lacks is a figure who's like a child to him, which gets taken care of in the original trilogy. Before anyone decides to get clever, in the comments, yes, I am aware of Ahsoka and how she could be considered someone who fills that role in the Clone Wars series, but at the time these films were coming out, Ahsoka didn't exist, and I don't think the idea of Anakin having an apprentice was on anyone's mind. It certainly wasn't conveyed in Revenge of the Sith, so we're not counting her, and this is a good time to just point out that I'm going to primarily talk about the films and only really borrow from other elements if it's helpful to clarify understanding. Back to the topic. Padme, by being the romantic attachment, means Anakin has all of the attachments that could create tension between him and his loyalty to the Jedi Order, because of the Jedi specifically forbidding any romantic attachment. We'll get to how Anakin actually dismantles this in the film later on. If we cast our minds to Revenge of the Sith, this romantic attachment is precisely the thread that Palpatine pulls on in order to compel Anakin to betray the Jedi and pledge himself to the Sith. In other words, it's basically the load-bearing component of the entire fucking plot, which means it needs to be communicated competently in the acting and dialogue, which, if you know anything about the prequels, you know that's not happening, or it needs to be structurally, thematically, and characteristically credible and built on a strong foundation, which again, if you know anything about the prequels, you know that this isn't necessarily the case the whole way through. Failure to achieve any major component of this will leave you with the base of your plot being undermined thoroughly by a romance that no one could credibly believe is the romance that turns the Chosen One to the dark side, which is what this needs to be. The other potential outcome is that the characters are so contradictory, not flawed, which is a different issue, or their established characterization is so strongly overwritten that you end up making utterly incoherent gibberish. Alternatively, and perhaps most catastrophically, you could end up doing both of these things, which would leave your grand narrative at the mercy of being rehabilitated by meme culture, which has led to some reevaluations of the prequels that are suboptimal at best and meme-laden remembrances at worst. In fact, as I was writing the script, I was recommended no fewer than 3 videos that attempted to defend both the Episode 2 romance plotline and the characterization of Anakin. I didn't watch them because I didn't want this video to degenerate into a response to those, but as we'll see, none of this is really defensible. Let's dive into the actual romance plotline, because there's a lot about it I want to talk about at a high level. First of all, like a lot of the prequels, in concept, the romance plotline across all of the films is actually quite a sound one. The idea of a romantic love luring a character into an almighty tragedy, which parallels a democracy succumbing to authoritarianism, on the basis of an entirely confected security threat, is a really good idea. It's also a relevant story to tell both at the time of release, where the issue of the day was how much freedom we were willing to surrender in exchange for guarantees of security, which it turns out had consequences that have echoed through to today and will continue to echo, but it also has a specific relevance now, again, for reasons. The romance plotline in Episode 2 has a lot going for it. It even has a lot of the required components to make a forbidden love romance work. You have an excuse for the two to spend an extended period of time alone in each other's company. You have probably the perfect setting for two people to fall in love. There's moments where the two actually demonstrate a little bit of chemistry. They have multiple moments where the forbidden nature of their romance leads to denials of the mutual attraction they're supposed to have. There's also that moment coming out into the Geonosian Colosseum where they kiss. Now, I do find the reasoning behind it being forbidden on Anakin's end to be a bit weak. Like, the whole Jedi aren't allowed to get married thing is not the strongest source of tension here, especially when Anakin himself interprets Jedi philosophy in a way that essentially nukes this idea.
Attachment is forbidden. Possession is forbidden. Compassion, which I would define as unconditional love, is central to a Jedi's life. So you might say that we are encouraged to love
And it's not like Anakin is notoriously a sort of philosopher warrior. The thing is, and I only realized this upon watching this with Bridget Empire, who came up with this insight and deserves full credit for it, these elements of a successful forbidden love romance are kind of in the wrong order. That's before we even get to the performances and the contextual issues, like the part where Padme shuts down the romance and says Anakin makes her uncomfortable. The way that rejection is delivered would probably have come across less as a woman shutting down an incel if it was placed later in the story. It's a bit like they've started building a pyramid in a random order. Yes, eventually you'll have all of the things you'll need to have a pyramid. It just won't be a pyramid, and you don't get credit as if you did build one successfully. Upon the rewatch of the prequel trilogy I did, the romance plotline was actually worse than I remembered, to the point that it actually felt ridiculous to me that anyone could find Anakin attractive. To point to just one example, in the first scene where he's alone with Padme, he basically goes on an extremely childish rant about how unfair his situation is. And this scene ends in Padme shutting him down, which, again, I've mentioned before. But the final thing he says is incredible, because he says,
"Sorry, milady."
And I understand that it's the proper way to refer to her in universe, but wow, does the connotation of that word in the current day apply very effectively to Anakin, who largely has the affect of an incel, and the way this story treats Padme and his mother doesn't do anything to disabuse me of this impression. Essentially, what we're relying on is for the essential romance that will define this character and catalyze their fall to the dark side to be made credible on the basis that he's kind of hot. Which, sure, I'm not saying that Hayden Christensen isn't physically attractive, and I'm not one to judge on that front. But is that a sufficient basis for romance that's used to inflict a Greek tragedy on the protagonist, considering how impactful and important this particular plot is meant to be for both Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith? It's incredible just how badly this is all executed in practice. I genuinely could not sit through some of it without cringing, which is probably not a great sign. At most, in episode 2, there are 2 moments where the romance feels remotely credible and genuine, one of which involves no dialogue between Anakin and Padme, and the other one is the bit with the pair, which I know people don't necessarily like, but that is exactly the kind of stuff I would be doing if I had the Force and wanted to impress a date. Also, possibly because there's not very much, the dialogue isn't noticeably awful. Now, we're going to dive into specifics, understanding how bad both the facade of the plot is and the way the components that could have been a credible Forbidden Love plot were totally misused and set up in a way that doomed them to failure, which will be useful for those of you who want to understand just how bad the prequels actually are as films, because this is the plot that explains the underlying weakness of how these films were constructed. Firstly, I want to address a few low-hanging fruits that everyone always talks about, either about Attack of the Clones and the romance plotline specifically, or in general about the prequel trilogy itself, since unfortunately this plotline does exist within those films and any issues that permeate them will impact it. I've seen some of these used as excuses for how bad the romance plotline comes across, and to be honest, I don't think in the absence of these issues, this plotline becomes acceptable. The most obvious issue, and the one that everyone will have seen coming from a mile away, is that the dialogue is terrible.
I don't like sand.
Come on, you knew I had to put that clip in there, right? I'm not going to deny that some of the lines are cringe-inducing and are delivered in ways that sometimes made my skin crawl. But actually, there is a line of defense in this respect that I do take a little seriously, which is that Anakin is a member of a celibate monastic order, which, for those of us familiar with a certain type of British school, will know doesn't exactly produce well-adjusted people who are charismatic. That's actually a good point, but then I'd like to ask, in return, what's Padme's excuse? She's a high-profile politician who was formerly the elected head of state for her planet. You'd think she'd be able to come across as remotely charming, though I suppose you could argue that if you're the head of an entire planet at 14, your opportunities for normal socialization are limited. But how would she then be able to have what appears to be a relatively successful political career that extends into adulthood? Which highlights the real main issue here. The dialogue across the prequel trilogy is really bad. And actually, it's kind of bad in the original trilogy too. But that's not the thing we're focusing on here. Which, given the Star Wars films aren't silent movies, no matter how much we may wish this was the case, makes it a bit of a problem. It's remarkable how some of the best scenes in the romance plotline specifically are the ones with barely any dialogue, or at least dialogue that could be delivered without, just ruining the vibes. I don't want to harp on about it for too long, but I want you to hold this thought in your head. If we had a version of these films where the dialogue was good and the characters spoke like actual people do we think this romance plotline is suddenly rescued from itself? I'm not convinced, and you'll see why shortly once we get into the rotten core and foundations of it all, but for now, let's leave the terrible dialogue behind. Another thing that people like to point to is a lack of chemistry between the actors. And yeah, there's definitely something going on there. The performances range wildly from extremely, perhaps too subtle, all the way to being so on the nose, either through the body language, the aforementioned dialogue, or the costuming, that you can't really take it seriously. This really doesn't help, and unlike the dialogue, it's not one where I can really accept the celibate monastic order excuse at all, because it is just straight up bad performances, probably under subpar directing. None of this is how people interact with each other, let alone people who are supposed to be mutually attracted to one another. It's not that there are no moments with chemistry, but again, it's telling that these are the ones where the characters aren't really talking to or directly interacting with each other, which again raises the same question. Do we think there's a level of performance from the actors that salvages this plotline? Now, admittedly, if we were talking about a situation where they were able to perform the romance plotline in a convincing way, we'd probably be talking about a totally different story, or at the very least the pieces of the plotline would have been assembled in the correct order. Or we'd at least see the way the characters' personalities complement each other beyond mere physical attraction and childhood idolization of the pretty girl from space, which again, we're gonna get to, because the way they met is a big part of the problem. The final piece of low-hanging fruit is simply the notion that this romance plotline is obviously going to be bad because it's just in the worst prequel film. And yes, being in a bad film does have a way of submerging any redeeming qualities. Just one thing though. This is a solid 50% of the plot, so if this plot is bad, doesn't that kind of mean the film would be bad too? It's not like this is a minor plot element that actually works quite well that's attached to an awful film. It's awful because it is the key part of the awful film, and it's not good. Anyway, that's enough of the easy stuff. Let's start properly trying to dissect this mess a little bit. This was something I considered leaving in low-hanging fruit because the age gap, or maturity gap as time goes on, between Padme and Anakin is, to me, quite an obvious issue. I know for a fact that other people have talked about it. It's even the case that Anakin was originally written to be 12, which I think would have headed off a lot of the problems here. The argument I've seen is that by making him 9, you make his separation from his mother more traumatic, which I guess so, but equally, if the issue is going to be that he's too old and has pre-existing attachments, I would argue that 12 is also fine. The film we got has the age gap that it does, meaning in episode 2 that Anakin is 19 and Padme is 24. And when I explained this to a friend, they didn't seem to see this as an immediate problem, which leads me to believe that this isn't low-hanging fruit. Now, in fairness to this friend, they didn't know the ages off the top of their head, and I didn't lead with it right away. I just simply said, well, the age gap between them is weird, without giving numbers. And they hadn't watched the films in a while, but I would put it to you that if you were 24 and your friend who was 24 introduced you to their partner who was 19, you might have some questions about that. That assumes that they met when they were those ages, and to be clear, I'm not saying that 19 isn't an adult, right? But you have to acknowledge that there's quite a big gap in normal circumstances between people of these ages, let alone the specific circumstances in the film and the film before, which, by the way, reflect very poorly on Padme. Let's walk through how they first met. When they first met, this is what they looked like, and even if I didn't tell you their ages, you can see that one is noticeably younger than the other, which is why Padme says this line when they have their awkward reunion.
And he'll always be that little boy I knew on Tatooine.
Which, you have to say, means you're facing a pretty big uphill battle to create a credible and non-creepy romance between these two now. Consider that Padme was 14 and Anakin was 9. So there's going to be a maturity gap once they're both adults. And that's before we get into how different the stages of their lives are in episode 2. Something Padme explicitly points out.
No, you listen. We live in a real world. Come back to it. You're starting to become a Jedi. I'm a senator.
To which I would say, yes, Padme, exactly. It's not like the characters are unaware of this, and to lay it out in more explicit terms, I will give you my description of where these characters are in their lives as of episode 2. Anakin is a Jedi Padawan, or as Padme puts it, studying to become a Jedi, which actually makes it feel kind of worse on her part, which means that he is, despite the prophecy about him, effectively a nobody in the grand scheme of things. I get it. Jedi Padawans are going to be different from some guy, say, trying to sell you death sticks in a bar, but relatively speaking, he's not exactly the figure he'd become as the Clone Wars were coming to a close. Then we have Padme, whose political career is a little confusing to me, because when we meet her in episode 1, she's the elected Queen of Naboo despite being 14. But fine, we'll chalk that up to some kind of political tradition on that planet. But in episode 2, she's a senator and a prominent member of an anti-war faction in the Senate. So prominent that she's the target for assassination attempts. And even if it was disgruntled spice miners, that gives her a level of prominence and responsibility that Anakin simply doesn't have. All of this goes a long way to explaining why there's a big maturity gap between these two. Anakin is, for all intents and purposes, still a child in many ways, which is why he resorts to a lot of sort of Linkin Park Numb-style lamentations and acts up in front of Padme by challenging Obi-Wan. Despite all of this, and despite the fact that the mission to protect Padme should have been their first meeting instead of Watto's shop, this is not in and of itself an insurmountable challenge. Yes, it's an explicitly forbidden relationship in Anakin's case because of being a celibate monk, and in Padme's case because, well, not to assume what the Star Wars galaxy social norms are, and to assume that they're the same as ours, but I would suspect Senator dates 19-year-old comes off about the same in that setting as it does in the real world, even if the Senator is 24. This doesn't have to be a killing blow to the romance plotline because Padme's appeal to Anakin is obvious. The challenge is, how do you make Anakin appealing to her in a way that doesn't make her come across as a creep who's kissing a guy she sees as a child, and who gives her no reason to see him as anything other than that? You would do this by having Anakin throughout the film live up to his reputation from older entries in the series, by being heroic, perhaps by having him display surprising emotional maturity, and by having him be charming. Oh, that's right. So Anakin has a lot of problems as a character in this film that reverberate throughout the wider plot. And a lot of those are relevant to this plotline. For now, I want to focus on his conduct during the time he and Padme spend together. The overall theoretical structure of this is supposed to be, initially the feelings Anakin has are unrequited because of all of the obvious reasons they would be, and we just covered a lot of them. Then they're supposed to warm up to each other, and then it progresses as you'd expect from there. snowballing into Padme's extremely awkwardly phrased confession. And yes, I know I said I wouldn't go on about the dialogue, but my god, it's bad. I think there's really nothing wrong with what's laid out here if you handle it properly. Unrequited love can be kind of a swing in a lot of directions, but the overwhelming way it comes across is creepy, and given the maturity gap on display between the characters, there's a real tense awkwardness about any scene where both this gap and Anakin's affections are on display. I want to draw your attention back to a clip I showed you earlier of them speaking to each other where Padme shuts down Anakin in quite a brutal and deserved way. Throughout this scene, Anakin is whinging constantly about how unfair everything is, and with maximum respect to teenagers, this is how a teenager stereotypically expresses themselves, which would be bad enough, but then we get this exchange that I showed you earlier, which ended with her shutting him down. She has an incredibly good set of reasons to shut this down at this point. Anakin has been assigned as her bodyguard, so she's gonna have to spend a lot of time with him, which makes this moody teenager being inappropriate in a professional setting quite an urgent thing to deal with. Again, I get that Anakin is from the celibate monastic order, so the awkwardness isn't inherently a character issue or something that damages the integrity of the character. That being said, there is such a thing as awkward charm, and I want you to really think about all the time that Anakin and Padme spend together before they go off to Tatooine, because that's a game changer all on its own. How many moments of genuine charm does he display? There's the bit with the pair, and I guess that bit in the field that's in all of the memes. But even that second one is a bit suspect. Setting aside the meme format that spawned from it, what actually happens in this scene after a bit of casual frolicking in the fields is Anakin is asking about Padme's old boyfriends, and she describes one of them, and in true angsty teen fashion, Anakin pouts and gets defensive about it, which I can't say for sure people would find that unattractive, but yeah, it's not exactly great, is it? Bitterness about exes is usually not something that endears someone to someone else. Now, maybe that's Padme teasing him and she was goading a reaction out of him, but still, is this what we think she would have wanted from this conversation? Then this conversation turns onto politics, which is the bit the meme is based on, and Anakin actually almost appears passably charming at one point, until he describes autocracy as his preferred political system, which, that's a pretty big red flag if you were asking me, that this apprentice space wizard, who's supposed to be the most powerful member of his order once he reaches his full potential, is pretty openly saying, at least Mussolini made the trains run on time, but in space, which, as an aside, Mussolini didn't do that, and the system he describes doesn't really work on any appreciable timescale. He tries to play this off as a joke, and it seems to work, but it does come across to me at least a bit like one of those jokes where you're saying what you really believe, but you're kind of feeling out the room a little bit, which, again, is the calling card of the insecure teenager trying to punch above their weight in a discussion with someone about their own field of expertise. Already, he's been kind of a creep, and he's kind of a fascist. Now, Padme isn't off the hook on the creep allegations because she bizarrely indulges this, and, well, you remember the infamous sand line. Well, she kisses him after that, so I guess if anyone is interested, I also don't like sand. I'm just saying, I'm quite single at the moment. I'm putting it out there. Now, I know people on the internet don't understand how jokes work, so I just want to be clear. That is not serious. Please don't take that seriously. Just don't, okay? I want to highlight another thing that I'd forgotten about that screamed at me during the rewatch. There's a part where they've successfully made it onto Naboo, and Padme's talking to a bunch of, I guess, senior political figures about where she should go into hiding on the planet. And Anakin keeps interrupting her for some reason. it really does stand out just how much he's offended by not being in charge of her security in every way and getting to be in control of the situation. Now, Padme absolutely stands up for herself here and makes the point that she knows her home planet better than Anakin, you know, which is kind of obvious. So he does back down, but it's such a big old red flag again that he's like this. Up until they go to Tatooine, it's just moment after moment of Anakin showing off in different ways just how unattractive he is in terms of his personality, or at least should be to someone who's in a much more serious position in life than he is. Whether he's the head of security or not, he just comes across as an absolute child. To summarize for this section, Anakin generally behaves like a moody brat for significant parts of this, for significant parts of his and Padme's time together, and the outbursts that produces are bad enough that I'd sincerely question why Padme was into him, unless we're going with the Hayden Christensen is kind of hot defense, which again, you're welcome to make, but then you have to accept what that says about Padme, and about the root causes of a tragedy that's meant to be so massive and have so much gravity that an entire political system and ancient monastic order is destroyed over it. Now, to be a little fair here, I'll bet that outside of the memes, you probably didn't remember anything specific about the scenes before they left for Tatooine. In fact, some of the meme formats don't even get, like, remotely accurately reflect the dialogue of the scenes they're referring to, which is fine, by the way. I promise I'm not like the meme analysis guy, and I'm not saying it makes the memes less funny. When I watched these films back to back, I didn't really think much about Anakin saying he didn't like sand, or that weirdness where he tries to undermine Padme, or that scene where they attempt to make it look like there's some kind of underlying sexual tension between these two. Which means that the damage being done here is, you know, it's bad because it's damage, but you could argue it's superficial if you just don't think about it too hard, which I'm sure is a defense we've all heard before about numerous films, particularly Star Wars films. Plus, the film's not over yet, and there's such a thing as character growth, and there's a great opportunity to have Anakin experience some of that. Our prophesized chosen one is getting premonitions, and it's about his mother. One of those attachments he's not supposed to have as a Jedi, which means he may be about to experience the loss of a parent, which, not to understate it, is a huge moment in someone's life. One which forces you to pause and actually reflect upon your life and their life, where you want to be and what you really want to do. In the context of a romance plotline, that's honestly on life support. This could really have been played in a way that believably molds Anakin in a way that could make him appealing to someone like Padme. Plus, I guess she'd be feeling pretty sorry for him, so let's hope that he doesn't act in a way that violates the code of ethics of the Jedi, or those we could comfortably ascribe to Padme, fatally damaging her character if she chooses to overlook those for the sake of getting the plot we need to have. God damn it. It's time to talk about the part where Anakin kills the Sand People. Right, we need to just take a breath for a moment, because I'm going to say something that I think is obvious, and that I think is communicated very clearly by the film itself, but that I just have this nagging feeling that it's going to upset someone. So here goes. Killing the Sand People was bad, actually. Also, there's actually one or two instances of good acting from Hayden Christensen around the death of Anakin's mother, so good job. This act is supposed to represent the first of many steps Anakin takes towards becoming Darth Vader, and it neatly illustrates how the final blow will be dealt to him on that path, by the first one being the death of his mother, who dies in his arms, making him give in to his rage, where he kills not just the men,
but the women and the children too.
Those are his words, and I don't care what personal slight has been done to you. Children are innocent, even if they're raised in cultures you find distasteful. You don't get to do an emotional support genocide. which is a message that is sadly extremely relevant in the real world. To go on a little tangent, if you'll indulge me, I actually did a video about the Sand People's depiction in Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, and while I'm reluctant to accept something from a game that's no longer canon and old enough to drink in America, my overall understanding of the Sand People in that game is that they are an indigenous people / culture resisting colonialism, and that is probably a reasonable conclusion to draw just from the material in the films themselves. I think that there are a few key points of evidence from the films alone. Sorry to anyone who wants to hear me talk about the Book of Boba Fett, but you'll have to get me to like 1,000 patrons before I even approach touching that mess. Going back to A New Hope, the way that they resort to ambush tactics and the way Obi-Wan describes how they move reflects a deep understanding of their environment and tactics that resemble resistance movements in the real world. The second piece of evidence I'd like to point to is from the pod race, where the Sand People are sniping at the pods. Now, there's an element of the racers and everyone else just treating this like some kind of environmental hazard, but I don't think it's that simple. Just because no reaction has been provoked doesn't mean that this is some prearranged deal between the Hutts and the Sand People. I'm not saying that it's definitely a reaction to this pod race offending them in some fashion. That's not in the film, and I'm not going to pretend it is. But it's not massively outside the realm of possibility, and I think it lends credence to this idea a little bit. It's definitely a valid way to look at it, if you ask me. Finally, I'd like to introduce you to the character whose name has the worst mouthfeel, I think, in all of Star Wars. Klieg Lars, Anakin's stepdad, who says the following about what he calls the Tuskens, which at least feels less like a slur than Sand People, which does sound a lot like the way people in colonial societies referred to the people they colonized. In fact, the way Anakin speaks about them during his confession confirms this in my mind when he says,
"They're like animals, and I slaughtered them like animals."
Which means that this is potentially a thematically rich part of the film where Anakin could do a lot of things in the name of creating interesting tensions in the narrative going forward. To be clear, I think that the act of Anakin killing the Sand People is actually a really good way to illustrate his first steps in falling to the dark side. But in order for it to work with the romance plotline, the one thing he can't do is just tell Padme what he did. And if he does this, the one thing Padme can't do is unconditionally forgive him.
To be angry is to be human.
Oh, for fuck's sake. Let's break down why this not only doesn't work, but is a fatal wound to the character of Padme, limits Anakin as a character, and makes this whole romance plotline fail on its own terms. First, let's talk a bit about Padme. As we progress through the prequel trilogy, she becomes less and less her own person, reduced to essentially a prop in Revenge of the Sith. And part of the reason why that happens is because the interesting elements of her character are utterly scorched here in favor of a contrived romance. What do we know about Padme by this point in the story? Well, we know that she was the Queen of Naboo when she was 14, which, again, we'll have to sort of ignore that particular aspect of it because it raises quite a few questions for me. And that she was so popular in that role that people wanted to amend the Constitution to allow her to keep the role, which, now you think about it, makes her an interesting foil to Palpatine. Again, different video at that point. So we have an image of a popular, competent politician who stepped up from her homeworld and has become a senator, presumably succeeding Palpatine's successor, given she had to see out her term as queen. Where she's now a prominent member of an anti-war, or at least anti the creation of an army, which I would argue is the most anti-war position that could possibly exist, faction within the Senate. A political position that implies that she has strong views about the use of violence, probably quite negative ones, if I had to speculate. Now, some of you will say that it's actually okay for Padme to unconditionally forgive Anakin for two reasons. One, because she's acting out of compassion given the loss he's just suffered, which is total nonsense. And if we're saying that's the moral framework she operates under, then I have some serious questions about a lot of other things she claims to believe. The second reason is she might just have internalized the racism the settler society of Tatooine has regarding the Sand People, regarding them as people who must die. And don't worry, I'm not about to get all necropolitics on you, but you see how this is a problem, right? On her home planet, there's an entire separate species which she, admittedly under some quite opportunistic circumstances, reconciles with. If she was going to hold a prejudice against non-humans or other cultures, don't you think she'd display that about the Gungans? Because, like, if she's a racist, then racism doesn't just exist towards one group on the individual level. Like, you'll never meet someone who's racist towards, say, black people who's okay with another group of people. These bigotries are comorbid. So why aren't her bigotries comorbid in that case? So no, I don't think you can handwave this particular issue. What this scene does is it utterly ruins the integrity of the character and makes scenes like her being upset about Anakin killing younglings feel totally ridiculous. It makes her eagerness to see the war end, her questions about the Republic, all of it feel like a joke. I get that a lot of scenes featuring her and Anakin in Revenge of the Sith carry a lot of those issues we talked about in the low-hanging fruit section. But even if you take out the dialogue, how can you take any of this seriously? Let's turn to Anakin, because I don't think the damage is limited to Padme here, though it is mostly directed at her. The act of unconditionally forgiving Anakin is probably the worst way to go about this scene. First of all, he shouldn't tell her, because he should be aware of her convictions and the likely reaction he'd get if he did tell her. But you can argue that he's in a spiral of grief and that's made him act out of character. Fine. But I still think if he does tell her, and if you think that's absolutely necessary, then why is she forgiving him like this? There's a lot of different ways this could have gone. And realistically, there's very few of them that don't end in her just being utterly repulsed by him. At no point is their romance remotely credible enough that it feels like something she'd compromise everything about herself in order to maintain. Equally, this completely caps Anakin as a character in this film, since his moments of heroism are so few and far between. If you wanted the scene where Anakin and Padme rush off to Geonosis to rescue Obi-Wan to work and be integrated into the romance, and this is just an idea I've come up with as I was writing this, Padme could have been repulsed and disgusted, but if there had been a better romance up to this point, she could have conditionally forgiven Anakin. Something about how she'll keep his secret because she doesn't want his life to be ruined. You know, that whole thing that's supposed to be preventing them from engaging in their romance openly. And that she sees the good in him, which would be a neat parallel to the original trilogy. But that he needs to actually be good in order for the secret to be kept. You know, romance, love, whatever you want to call it, can have conditional elements within it, and I don't think all love has to be totally unconditional in order for it to be compelling as a narrative or believable as love, especially in such an extreme narrative context. Instead, what we got was unconditional forgiveness that kneecapped one character's potential and reduced another to a prop. What a shame, honestly. The main takeaway I have here to summarize is that even though there are moments that could plausibly be considered to work within a romance plot, the thing they're attached to is so unsuitable that it beggars belief that anyone would find this credible. For all of the criticism of the characters just telling us things that we could make, the fact is that Padme is correct when she assesses that pursuing this romance would destroy them both. a fact acknowledged at the culmination of the romance plotline, forever solidifying that this is the romantic attachment that will ultimately be used to pull Anakin to the dark side. That is the text, and no matter how I might feel about the fact that the Jedi forbidding marriage is one of the weakest potential sources of tension, that is the tension they play with. Which means that we have to believe that Padme would risk her entire political career for a pouty, unstable 19-year-old whose inability to regulate his emotions not only push him to commit an atrocity, but when combined with his sheer potential power, could make him the most dangerous person to ever exist. I'm just not buying it. One thing I should have touched on more is the distinct lack of heroism displayed by Anakin. Now, I understand that a protection mission where you're in a remote location isn't the perfect time to display that side of yourself. It's hard to be a hero when you're chilling in a fancy villa. And I guess we do have that sequence where he saves Obi-Wan, but I have a whole other set of gripes with that bit. Surprise, surprise, I guess. It's just that in order for a character to fall, they have to be falling from somewhere. If Anakin's baseline is already indulging in his powers for bad reasons, then why do we need a romantic attachment to tip him over into the dark side completely? You see how it feels unnecessary for this to be the backbone of 50% of the plot of this movie when you think about it like that. And that has impacts for Revenge of the Sith too, because where do we get the first impression that Anakin would do anything for people he cares about beyond his basic duties that are a part of his role as a Jedi? Well, I would put that at the escape from Grievous's flagship in Episode 3, where he directly disobeys Palpatine to rescue Obi-Wan, which is good for that movie, but it does feel a little late in the day, especially when Padme and Anakin are already married and it's about to be revealed that Padme is pregnant. I do understand that part of Anakin's attitude issues in Episode 2 are because he's chafing a little bit under Obi-Wan's tutelage. It's made clear that Obi-Wan is keeping Anakin on too tight a leash and that he needs space and time away from him in order to find his feet a little as a Jedi. Which, yeah, given how poorly coordinated they are and how strained their relationship seems at times, it does make sense that he'd whine about it to the first sympathetic ear he finds in who knows how long. In a way, that process of needing that space and time is part of growing up, and if they wanted this to be Anakin's coming of age story, then they probably should have actually done that instead of trying to force a square peg into a round hole. Anyway, this is an incredibly frustrating plot line for me, and I'm glad I've got this out of my head. Obviously, this isn't, completely comprehensive, but I'm gonna leave the main part of this here. Before I send you off to the credit sequence, though, I do want to say that this was quite a lot of fun, and it was just a bit of fun. And I will defend the things that I've said here, but I'm also interested in hearing about if you disagree, or what you'd add to what I'd said, or whether I'm just great. You're allowed to say that as well. I would encourage it even. But yeah, this is a load-bearing plot element, and it's made out of wet cardboard, so that's one reason the prequels are like that. And I hope if you're watching this on the day of release, which is Valentine's Day, if everything has worked out, you've had a nice one, and you're watching this either happily alone, with a partner who you're happy with, or are just having a nice time. If you're feeling a little lonely, don't lose hope, because based on this romance plotline, there really is someone for everyone. Even a pouty, creepy, moody, genocidal teenager can marry Natalie Portman, and that should give hope to us all. See you on the next one. I need to thank my proofreader, who did a fantastic job giving me notes here. Really, really fun video to do. So, if you did like it and you want more of this kind of thing, remember to like and subscribe. I don't know if hype is a thing. I don't know how hype works, but if you want to hype it, that's also cool. I'm also okay with that. And I need to thank the patrons and members who have really stuck with me through, you know, quite a down period for me personally and on the channel, but it feels like it's picked up a little bit again, and so I really do appreciate their support, especially the top tier patrons: Drone Riff, Kersley Scheider, Liron, Jar Jar Mubar, and Carolyn, and the YouTube members Nadi Jiwa, Katie Marshall, Roger Zugi, and Ben Johnson. All of them are absolute legends. If you want the videos early, if you want to vote on the topics of videos, if you want all of that good stuff, you know, the usual Patreon stuff, well, the links will be in the description. You know where to go. With that, everyone, I will catch you all in the next video, and see you then. Bye.